Hey everyone. So this is a small channel with almost no subscribers. It's the perfect time to burn bridges. So let's talk about the least satisfying part of D&D, religion. So why is religion the most unsatisfying part of D&D? It's because people in this world have no religion. Well, I don't mean to insult people and say they don't, but when was the last time you went to church or synagogue or mosque? If you're the vast majority of people in Western countries, maybe Christmas? It's almost Easter time, so maybe you're thinking about making a trek. It won't be until next Christmas. And the problem is this affects the way that people play D&D. What's the difference between a cleric or a paladin or even a monk and, let's say, like a wizard or a sorcerer? Nothing. It's just a different spell set and you're a little bit more healy, but that's about it. If you're making a campaign and you really want to treat the world differently and you want people to get into religion or their religion for their character, I've got some tips. We've got some ways to create the world. But first, let's start by understanding how religion works in our world. In the beginning, man was a hunter-gatherer. He ate from the land and took what he needed. And back in those days, you really didn't have any organized religions. You had what we call shamanism or animism. So the defining characteristics of shamanism are that everything in the world has a spirit. There's the tree spirit, the rock spirit, the water spirit. If you got a disease, well, you pissed off that dandelion spirit. That's what you get for crushing it. You had a certain class of people who were able to speak with these spirits or divine their intentions and beg them to intercede on your behalf, or at least not to hurt you anymore. So there were a few ways that these shamans could become shamans. One is that you were born this way. Your father was a shaman, your grandfather was a shaman, so now you're a shaman, no matter how much you want to do flower arrangement. And you grow up and you learn the shamanistic rituals, and hopefully you're good at it and your whole village doesn't die. The other way is that you have some sort of spiritual epiphany. Maybe one day you're going to drown, but the water spirit saves you. And after that, you realize you can speak to them. Or maybe you were hanging out at the sweat lodge or ate a bunch of magic mushrooms and you hallucinated your ass off and the gods spoke to you. The gods being whatever animals crawled over your half-naked body on the forest floor. Animism is pretty much the same thing, except it involves a lot more ancestor worship. So your father, the greatest shaman of all time, when he dies, when the boar spirit gets tired of him and just kills him in the night, you'll build an altar to him and you will sacrifice things. Could be fruit, could be animals, could be your children, whatever you got, it's good. The societies that practice shamanism and animism, they generally sort of died out. Now, it's not universally true. We see it more in smaller cultures, more decentralized cultures. We still see a little bit of ancestor worship, like let's say in Asia. At a funeral, you'll burn fake money, so they have money and cash and stuff in the afterlife. You might burn a fake iPhone. I guess reception's good out there. You see it a little bit in Mesoamerican Indian groups who hold on to their identities. And you don't really see it in any Western countries. Why? Well, they've moved on. As societies got together, the gods became more concrete. The practice of worshiping them became more centralized. So there was a lot of changes. The only country in the world that is, let's say, developed and still practices this is Japan. Shinto is still a form of animism and shamanism. Shamanism light, we'll say, in the form of the Shinto priests. how does this manifest itself? Well, I lived in Tokyo for a while, and one day I'm at a park and this kid's being a little jerk throwing rocks into a pond. And most of you would probably tell the kid, hey, stop it, that's not right, it's not a good thing to do. But this mother says to her little 5-year-old, if you throw rocks in there, you'll make the river spirit angry. In shamanism, there's no question, are there spirits? Yes, there are spirits. They are all over the place, and you better treat them nice. You better give them libations and gifts and sacrifices and give them their due, or, well, you might piss them off and they'll be coming for you. Would conquer the others and ended up in control of these city-states. As these city-states grew in power and they conquered their neighbors, their god would beat some other god. But in order to create unity, you start to see different tribes' gods sort of meld into one bigger, kind of awesomer god. Or you'll see, for example, a Babylonian god, and then you conquer another city. Well, that city's god is in the pantheon, but he's not as awesome as the god of Babylon. So in this way, we start to see pantheons, and we start to see more mythology and legends and stories explaining how all these gods work together and sort of the origin of the earth. As time progresses, farming develops, people stop moving around as much, and they settle into little village tribal communities. And one thing that happens is there starts to be more of a standardization, and specific gods are worshipped. Now, the first gods were often animals. You see this a bit you can still see it in African legends, the Anasazi brothers, things like that. But after time, these animals, who were a very real threat in the human world at the time, became anthropomorphized. Okay, what does this mean? So you start having gods that take on humanish features. And really, one of the first places we see this is ancient Egypt. So in ancient Egypt, you had Thoth with the head of a falcon. You had different gods with different bodies, crocodile, hippo, whatnot. Usually it's the body of a human with the head of an animal, but they retain the ability to shift back and forth. When we see this, we start to see organized religion develop. There becomes sort of a priestly caste, which is just a larger version of the shamanistic, your father was a shaman, so you're a shaman. Well, your father was a priest, you were born into a priestly family. Guess what, buddy? You're a priest. Now, there could be other ways to get into it. So you could be some sort of orphan who was given to the temple. Maybe you were in a rich family and, well, you're second born, so you don't get any land. Therefore, your family shoves you off to the temple to hopefully be some famous muckety-muck. We officially sanctioned religious rites. We see writing, where different rituals, instead of just passed down orally from one generation to the next. So now you could have people 100 years later performing the same rituals, theoretically without any degeneration in the passing of information. So after a time, when the animal world became less of a threat, especially for people living in cities, what happens is the gods take on more human presence. Now, some of these gods are really the same gods, they just sort of morph over time into more humanistic ones. But what we have are basically the Greek and Roman gods. We have the Nordic gods, and even some you would see in Mesoamerican cultures, although they're a little bit more in the last group. So this brings us to the height of the classical period, where everybody was still sure that gods and some ghosts and spirits were around, but you're starting to get intellect. You're starting to see less shamanistic practices. You're sick? Well, it's not because some spirit is angry with you. You have the Chinese in about 260 BC, they came out with the Huangdi Neijing, where we get acupuncture herbal medicines from, and that was a specific rejection of it. There you see certain gods developing, although not in an organized sense like you see in the West. And someday I'll talk about different Asiatic religions. But concentrating more on the West, you have all those, and you see the seeds of what would become the Abrahamic religions with the ancient Judaism. It's very clear, older times in the Bible, that there were many gods and they were wiped out, basically by thought. So the ancient Jews, they saw that there were many gods, but oh no, we like this one God. And then as time develops, they say, oh no, there aren't really other gods, there's just this one. The others are evil spirits, fallen angels. So this could be something interesting for your campaign, that maybe there were many gods, but now everybody worships one, and those other gods, they want to come back. So after this period, we end up with monotheism or pseudo-monotheism. So there were certainly religions like Zoroastrianism, where you had a duality between a good god and a bad god, but we're sort of weeding out the pantheon here. So certainly in the Middle East, you end up with the three main religions, starting with Judaism, Christianity, finishing up with Islam. In ancient Judaism, you really have a polytheistic religion where the people said, okay, there are many gods, but this one God, this El guy, we love him. Or Yahweh, depending on what period you're reading and who's writing it. In the Old Testament, you see a lot of different gods. You have El, who's the main god of the Canaanites, and where we get the image of an old guy with a white beard floating on a cloud. These kind of monotheistic religions, what we end up with are very, very structured organizations. They have a strict hierarchy. You have, let's say, Catholicism. You have the Pope. That's one guy in charge of a Christian sect for the whole world. You have similar structures in Judaism, where rabbis of certain regions at certain times would have been considered a high muckety-muck. Same thing in different caliphates for Islam. You see very structured, very stringent beliefs. They do not like other religions in general. Like, hey, we're right, you're wrong, accept our view, or, well, we're going to put you to the sword. Another thing you see later on is more sort of a reformist type view. So you have these very rigid structures. People eventually break away from the structures, but they keep the main ideas of the religion. Usually what we're talking about is like a change in administrative duties. So you could talk to a Sunni or a Shiite Muslim, and they would agree perfectly on the main tenets of Islam. But when you get into specifics of like who's in charge or this and that, then no, the other guys are all heretics. So here we end up with the last of the major religious epochs, at least according to our current world. And that's basically where you have science take over and religion becomes less and less important on a daily life. Most of man's needs are sort of taken care of. Yeah, there's hunger in the world, there's insecurity, there's war. But in general, we're doing pretty good. We've conquered a lot of diseases. We've wiped a few out completely. We could feed everybody if we wanted to. There's been a lot less war than there has been ever. Things are pretty good. And what happens is you start to see a lack of belief in general, and people who do believe are sort of looked down upon, especially if they wear that on their sleeve. No, it's not a universal rule. There's differences and there's tensions in different communities. But starting 150 years ago, maybe 200 years ago, you start to see the age of reason, where people are more into science, and the value of religion is much less. In this time, when religion gets devalued, you start to see reactions against that, and you start to see movements like the Mennonites, who want to go back to a simpler time. You see like the Amish, no electricity, no buttons, because, buttons lead you straight to hell. And then you see opposing religions. Satanism wasn't a thing until 100 years ago, 150 years ago, because traditionally Satan was the loser in the heavenly war between God and the angels, cast down into hell, blah, blah, blah. And so now people are like, I don't like this Christianity stuff, so I'm going to go with the opposite guy who's a loser. And why you'd worship a loser is another question, but what about in your world? Do you have a main religion? Maybe somebody will worship the enemy of whatever your main god or gods are. So I hope you enjoyed part 1. We'll get back to part 2 with how you would set up a religion, and eventually, hopefully in part 3, we'll get into more of how do you play a religion so that you make your players, who might normally be uncomfortable, comfortable expressing religious views.